everybody, it's Ruby here today, and I thought that I would talk a little bit about Alan Moore. I wanted to do an introduction about Alan Moore because he is easily one of my favorite writers of all time, and I've noticed that although some booktubers will read some of his stuff if they're just getting into graphic novels, I've found a lot of comments or other booktubers who haven't really realized that some of the movies they've watched or some of the books they've read have been sort of by the same author. So I thought that I would kind of explain who he is. Four of his probably most famous graphic novels, or the ones that you probably notice the most, as well as their movie adaptations for anybody who has no idea who I'm talking about, but has probably seen a couple of Hollywood films in the last couple of years. One thing to keep in mind is that his work is often to sort of shock and amaze. He sometimes has very violent imagery in his graphic novels, and he often uses sex and violence as a way to shock. This is something that he likes to do in his art. It is not gratuitous violence, it is not just there to excite or to be kind of pathological. So far, everything that I've read by him has had a reason as to why he's made it gory. In one of his interviews, he even said that he believes art to be something that makes you uncomfortable. He basically said that if art doesn't upset you, and if it doesn't resettle any ideas that you've had, then there's no point to it. Otherwise, it's just reaffirming what you already know. So I wanted to mention that beforehand, not to try and scare anybody away, but because although I absolutely do love these novels, at the same time they can be a little bit queasy or not always to everybody's taste. That being said, I've found a lot of his work to be very political, and I've actually read one of his pieces for university, so a lot of people have analyzed it and have gone through it quite a bit, and some people have created annotations of his novels and things. So, I mean, I'm not the only one, hopefully, who's had these sort of ideas of him being more than just a sort of pulp fiction author. So, that being said, I will start with the first one. So the first one I would consider to be the most famous. I would describe it as something that gives a new look on superheroes and how our view on superheroes or heroes in leotards are often wrong because they are just people and they can make their own mistakes. And so this is about two generations of superheroes, one in the 50s, which you would notice from like Superman and those sorts of comics, and then the second generation in the 80s who try and replicate this sort of golden standard of superheroes. And then they find out that there have been murders going on and they've been banned from wearing masks, and generally their life starts to fall apart. I don't tend to like superhero comics or movies that much. Of course, I'll watch ones that, like The Dark Knight and stuff, that a lot of people have liked and have kind of catered to a larger audience, but I have absolutely loved this one because it talks more about humanity than it does about superheroes and superpowers. The one character in this that actually does have a superpower that can go above and beyond humans actually starts to separate himself from humanity and stops being able to empathize with people, which I think is a pretty accurate description as to what would happen because, I mean, if you're not human anymore, then you've lost some of your humanity. So the movie version of it came out in 2009. It was a fairly big deal. I remember when it was first out in cinemas, mostly because one of the main characters is a giant blue naked guy, and that was all people were talking about in my junior high when it came out. The comparison to the movie and the graphic novel, apparently a lot of the scenes are the same. Like, they actually took the literal illustrations from the book and made them into frames in the movie, and a lot of the grittiness and the 80s sort of feel and the sort of postmodern idea generally stayed the same. They did change the ending, and hilariously fans have actually debated as to whether or not that's a better ending. So out of all the movies that have been adapted from Alan Moore films, this is probably the best out of all of them. That being said, Alan Moore doesn't like any of his stuff being adapted into Hollywood movies, so you should always take that with a grain of salt. The second graphic novel is V for Vendetta. This was published in the 80s. This is more about the totalitarian government of the UK in the future and sort of the dystopian world, sort of dystopian more, I guess, just totalitarian, sort of 1984 style, after another major war like World War II. There are some hints and implications that there had been concentration camps in the UK, and so this is sort of what had happened afterwards. Evie, the main character, runs into V, who is the guy in the Guy Fawkes masks, and as she starts to discover more about V, she discovers about how he's trying to change the government and sort of his very odd views about anarchy and the like. This is probably my favorite. It is beautifully written and very political, and obviously has influenced people if this mask is also used by Anonymous and I believe the Occupy movement. So that's where it comes from. There was a movie that came out in 2005. This is with Natalie Portman and Hugo Weaving. It was also the movie that people were talking about because Natalie Portman shaved her head on camera. And I personally really love this movie. It is a movie that I keep coming back to. Did an excellent job in sort of recreating the feeling of the book, but they actually changed the moral of the story. And I hadn't really realized it until I read articles about it from other fans, because I only read it once when I was 16, so I mean, I don't have the best authority on it. And they were actually saying that in the graphic novel, it's about a guy who seems probably the only sort of non-feeling character, V, and everybody around him is humanized during the story. So you hear about the totalitarian leader, you hear about the policeman, you hear about all these people, and all of them are humanized, while he is sort of this political figure. In the movie, they did the opposite, where he is the only one that has emotion, he's the only one that has any sort of motive to do anything. And so they went from they basically humanized an anti-hero in the movie, and I guess it became probably the most Hollywood change, because they went from a sort of politically ambiguous character to one that had a clear motive and a very clear message. They also, because it was 2005, it had to do with like the Bush administration and Afghanistan, they had changed the era in it, and that was very odd as well. So that movie is good on its own, but it is ruined if you read the graphic novel, so take that as you will. The third graphic novel is From Hell, which he published in the 90s. This follows the investigation of Jack the Ripper through the association of the royal family. So basically, you know, Victorian England. It is more of an evaluation of society. It sort of talks about the world that they're living in, and the murderer is a Freemason. So you also have a secret society, or not so secret society, also being a part of this. It has been criticized because it is extremely violent, because it is dealing with prostitutes that are being murdered, and he has a lot of fun with this, I guess. And I actually couldn't finish it. I think I got to the epilogue, or the very last sort of issue, and I couldn't finish it because it is extremely emotional and extremely graphic. Regardless, he definitely was more on the prostitute side. He isn't trying to glamorize, as far as I can tell, the murderer, and so I found it absolutely necessary that there was at least some gore in it. But I mean, he also likes gore just in general, so I mean, some of it could have just been him having fun. So the movie version came out in 2001, and it has Johnny Depp in it. There wasn't really much to this movie in general. It was more loosely based off of the book, where they basically took the same names of the characters and sort of some of the same relationships, and then just put it into a more detective-based movie instead of a more political or society-based story. So they definitely changed some of the characters around, and they changed some of the messages around, and a pinnacle scene in it, one where you kind of realize just how insane the murderer is and why he is doing it, isn't really in the movie, and that was what had stuck with me for years afterwards. So again, they're kind of good separate, but as soon as you read it, the movie is again ruined. Final graphic novel that I will be talking about is The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. So I actually bought these as they were being published. They started in 1999. Didn't start reading them in 1999, but I read them before they were in one big giant book, like From Hell is. like that, because it is a comic book basically. So I actually have them as they were being published. So I have like volume 1, 2, I have the Black Dossier, I have 1910, 1969, and the most recent one, which is 2009. So this one is a little bit harder to explain. He basically took a whole bunch of classical characters who were around in the Victorian age and put them together in a league of extraordinary gentlemen where they solved crimes that were and basically getting paid by the government. So you have Quartermain and Jekyll and Hyde and a couple of others that I don't actually know of except for in this book. And one of the main villains or aliens, I guess, that is involved is H.G. Wells. So there's definitely some overlap between different sort of genres and things. It is described as being steampunk. I would consider it also to be maybe sci-fi, if not gothic. And it's basically an adventure novel that is also steampunk. This is probably one of the most complex ones too. On almost every panel there is a lot of fictional characters that he has added, and there's a lot of references to other fictional books, which someone, a fan, had actually created into an annotations book that Alan Moore was perfectly fine with, which I'll link down below as well. And a couple of the main characters become immortal. Spoiler, not really. And then they go throughout time and start to fight crime throughout the ages and throughout the fictional characters that come up along the decades. There was a movie that came out in 2001 and it was a complete abomination. And it had a couple of famous actors in it like Sean Connery and I think Owen Wilson, but they had created it soon after he had started publishing them, so they had taken their own liberties as to what the plot was going to be, and they completely changed the dynamic of the group. They added American characters to it to try and appeal to an American audience, even though Alan Moore is doing fine in an American audience. And they also changed from having a female leader to having a male leader, which was kind of like the epitome of irritation, because Alan Moore has a lot of strong female characters, a lot of complex female characters, and Hollywood again changed that as well. I had watched it probably a couple years after it came out and I absolutely loved it. It was before I knew who Alan Moore was and probably the start of actually reading him, but and a lot of like the visuals and stuff like that are pretty good. It's Victorian, it's steampunk, it's adventure, it's great. But as soon as I read the books, I realized just how shortchanged they had made a lot of the characters and had made the plot. And it was pretty horrific, and really just don't really watch it maybe. That is my introduction to Alan Moore, as well as the movie adaptations that I had watched. Hopefully that gave you a little bit of an introduction to him. I could definitely go in depth. I've done essays on him and I've looked him up and I've watched interviews and I may have gone to the city that he's lived in. So I am a huge fan of him, but I think that this should be more of an introduction to him as well as my own views. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, you can put it in the comment section down below, and you should thumbs this up or share it or do your general thing of subscribing. I also have all of my links down below, and so I will talk to you guys later. Goodbye.